Welcome to this week's edition of Drupal Chat. I'm Mark Isaacson, and I am your host each week. You can find me on Drupal.org at Vegan Triathlete. Today, I'm going to be talking with Jennifer Hodgden about how she got involved with Drupal. And Jennifer's been involved with Drupal for 8 years and 9 months at this point. And in fact, at this point, Jennifer happens to be a core committer. But she didn't start out that way. And we're going to talk a little bit to find out about how she did start out and how she's progressed through her involvement with the community. So the discussion for today I put up there was, you don't have to be a code monkey. And this ties into a theme that I've been hitting pretty hard in my past few chats here, just to really drill it into people's minds that Drupal isn't only about the programmers and the coders. So thank you for agreeing to be on the show today, Jennifer. It's always nice to have somebody to talk to. So tell me.
I'm sorry that I don't have a video connection today. I wasn't even aware it was a audio chat. I was thinking text because it said I am. But anyway, we got that straightened out luckily before we started.
Yeah, we got it straightened out. We've got Jennifer's audio. And you know what? This is actually, it's fine. It's a funny thing to actually deal with the situation, because when I had contacted Jennifer, I didn't even think the fact that she wouldn't know that it was a video chat. That I've been using Blab for so long, and this is a type of thing that can happen a lot of times in the Drupal community as well, is that when we've been doing something for a long time, we don't remember what we didn't used to know before or what was difficult for us, and we'll make certain assumptions about things, and that could be some areas where people can get tripped up when they're first looking to get started in Drupal, because people who've been around for a while don't remember what they didn't know at some point. And so this is just a case in point here. Like, I didn't even think to explicitly tell Jennifer, this is a video chat that we're going to be doing. And so, you know what? You do the best you can. You got to have a sense of humor about it. I'm not going to get thrown off by it. And I'm certainly not going to have an attitude with Jennifer about it. But sometimes that's not the way things work in the Drupal community, because sometimes when people do forget what it was like to be a newbie, maybe they can get off on the wrong foot with some newbies.
Well, we try not to do that too much.
Right. We try not to, but just fair disclosure, it happens sometimes. And if that does happen to you, do recognize that you don't need to take it personally, because it just depends who you come across.
Well, let's not start with the negatives anyway.
Sure. Yeah, let's start. That's a good idea. Let's start with the good stuff. So you've been on, you had a Drupal profile for 8 years and 9 months now. I don't know, did you create your profile immediately, or did you actually use Drupal for a while before you created a profile?
I think it's hard to remember exactly when I created the profile versus started using Drupal, but I'm pretty sure I created my user account at least within a month or two of when I first tried Drupal. So somewhere around that time frame. And I was probably using Drupal when I created my profile. So I think we could probably add a month or two on there. And
okay.
Yeah, and I, like many people in the Drupal community, I came to Drupal from WordPress, and I had been actually an active contributing member of the WordPress community, such as it is, when I found Drupal and realized that it was a better fit for some of the things I needed to do. Okay. I can just give you a quick narrative and why I got involved in documentation, which is what people know me for in the Drupal community.
Absolutely.
And the reason was that when I got involved in the WordPress community, they have an online wiki documentation, which they had 9+ years ago, and still have now, called the Codex, and runs Wikimedia, just like Wikipedia. Anyway, MediaWiki. Sorry, MediaWiki is the software, so that's what it runs on. And the documentation there was awful. And so I thought, well, this is somewhere where I could contribute to this nice open source project. You use open source software, you want to contribute, at least some people do. And I've done a lot of technical writing, and so I thought, oh, I could help with this. And so I emailed the documentation list in the WordPress community and said, would you mind if I did some work on this? Can I, are you wedded to these pages, or can I fix them? And they basically said, yes, please. And so that's what I was doing in WordPress. So when I found the Drupal community, I naturally thought about starting out by getting involved in documentation in Drupal as well. So that's sort of a short history of the reason why I got involved in the Drupal documentation effort very soon after I joined the Drupal community. And then I went to a DrupalCon in Washington, D.C. was the first DrupalCon I went to. So that would have been 2009, I think. So 7 years ago or so. And at that time, I went to the documentation sprint, really, I got more involved in the Drupal documentation at that time because of Addison, who was the documentation team leader at the time, being so enthusiastic, and eventually then took over as documentation leader from her, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that's a kind of a nutshell. But the documentation was how I got involved in the Drupal community. Now, as far as being a code monkey, I was a code monkey before I got involved in WordPress or Drupal. But sometimes it's kind of hard to get your patches accepted. It's much easier to click edit and fix up the copy edit problems on a page, or fix something that's inaccurate, or write a better page for something, or reorganize some pages so that they actually have a logical flow to them, or something like that. And that people are very appreciative of documentation and sometimes less appreciative of your efforts in coding, at least in WordPress. I don't find Drupal to be quite that way, but that was kind of, I felt like I was much more appreciated doing documentation than coding when I was in the WordPress community. And so I just sort of transferred that over to Drupal.
Okay, so that is an interesting bit of history, and I actually do want to talk about it a little more since you do have WordPress experience and Drupal experience, and so I think it's worthwhile talking about that a bit, and not to bash WordPress, but it's for somebody who's done both of them.
I still use WordPress. So here I am, one of the arguably top 20 contributors to the Drupal project by some measures here and there, but and I still use WordPress. And I think WordPress is still a good choice for a lot of situations. If you're building a simple site or a blogging site, WordPress is going to get you up and going with what you need fairly quickly, and it's pretty intuitive, and you don't need to be a programmer or web developer or an expert really to set it up and go with it, or to edit the content in it. Drupal, what I tell people is, if you are building a site that fits WordPress's basic model of pages and posts, you could use WordPress. If you're doing anything more complicated, you could do it in WordPress. It's written in PHP. Drupal's written in PHP. You can do anything in WordPress that you could do in Drupal in principle. It's a question of whether it's going to be easier. And I think if you're building a simple site that fits WordPress's model, it's going to be a little easier to do it in WordPress. Maybe not for me because I use Drupal more, but for the average person. And if you're doing a site that doesn't fit WordPress's generic model of pages and posts or a blog or maybe a brochure site, then it's going to be easier to do it in Drupal. And I think you should, use whatever fits best. Don't try to use a hammer and when you need a screwdriver, and vice versa.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
That's kind of my take on WordPress versus Drupal.
Fair enough. Let's talk about I'd like you to actually talk about the community some, because one of the things that I've been stressing in these chats so much, this has been a big focus of mine, is this whole idea of how important community is in Drupal and how you have got the opportunities to become a part of the community and contribute to the community. And so tell us a little bit, and again, I'm not looking to bash on WordPress and to say, here's why Drupal is so much better, but can you compare and contrast the WordPress community to the Drupal community?
Yeah, the WordPress community is a community. And I'm sorry, I said that backwards. I think the Drupal community really is a community, and the WordPress community, in a lot of respects, isn't when you compare them. I don't want to say that the WordPress community is not a community at all, but the Drupal community has a lot more community aspects to it. The WordPress community, when I was involved in, admittedly, this is 8 or 9 years ago. Really, when I got involved in Drupal, I got out of being involved in the WordPress community, and it may have improved, but at that time, it was dominated by one company, Advomatic, that owned the trademark. All of the committers were from that company, and it was a little clique, and they weren't really that interested in having much involvement from other people. They would review your patches maybe and maybe commit them, but you had to make a really good case. I don't get that feeling. You know, people say that about the Drupal community, kind of that it may be dominated by one or two companies, but it isn't really that true, I don't think. And the other thing that I like about the Drupal community, especially as I've watched it evolve over the last 9 years, is that it really values being inclusive. And being a woman, that's very valuable to me. You know, yeah. The Drupal community has way more women in it than any other software development community that you'll ever find in a company or open source, I think, as a percentage. It's inclusive of people from different countries, from different backgrounds, of different cultures, of different, you know, race, ethnicity, whatever, you know, gender preference, transgender people, whatever, you know, it's like, we are not going to tolerate you being nasty to other people on the basis of something that's stupid like that. And so, and we just don't, as a community, you know, we've written down that value and we have a code of conduct. And if people violate the code of conduct, we have now a committee that works, of saints, as far as I can tell, that work on resolving disputes within the you know, within that framework of the community. And having a committee that's devoted to maintaining the community, as opposed to just a committee that's for the documentation and another committee that's for the software, that's just outstanding. And I think that there are a lot more aspects to the community than just that, but that says a lot about what the values of the community are and how strongly we feel about them. And so, you know, so you have that framework of, you know, this shared experience and a community that's trying to be inclusive and you know, maybe doesn't always succeed, but at least has a value and a defined value and has a written down value that we're going to be inclusive and welcoming. And it just goes a lot towards making it feel like a community. The other thing, I know you talked about this last week or the week before about the meritocracy. I mean, I think that the community values contributions from everybody according to what they want to do, what they're interested in doing, and what they're good at. And so, you know, if one person wants to write documentation, great, we love that. You know, if another person wants to write code, we love that too. If another person is a designer and wants to make a beautiful theme, that's wonderful also. And there may be some people in the community that don't value all these contributions equally. And, you know, if you're a coder, you may think code is the thing. And if you're a designer, you may think design is the thing. But as a whole, I think the community does value all of those contributions, and that hopefully everyone who wants to contribute to the project can find a place for themselves.
Yeah, and that's a key point. As I said, this is something I've been stressing for a number of chats now, because I am really looking to help people get that comfort level, that there's so many ways that you can get involved. And so actually, I think one thing that I want to follow up a little bit more on here is like the fact that you mentioned, so we've got this code of conduct, and then we've got people who help to enforce the code of conduct, and we have
let's say mediate disputes regarding the code of conduct. I don't think they try to enforce it, right? But yeah.
Okay, but address people's concerns.
Yes, that's right.
With it, yeah. And so, as you also mentioned, relatively speaking, there's a large percent of females involved in the Drupal community. This is all relatively speaking, not necessarily relative to the population of the world, but relative to any
software communities.
Software communities, and not to be you know, like gender biased either. There's quite a good number of people involved in the community who with different gender identities, and I think. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's pretty typical when you fill out a registration.
There's a pretty large LGBT community within the Drupal community. Yeah.
Yeah, LGBT.
It's not just that. Not just that, but another thing that, not to sidetrack what you were saying, but one of the things that we also have is a strong preference for making accessible websites, accessibility. And I think one of the reasons for that, I think back to this, there was this guy named Everett who was really active in Drupal 6 and 7 development, who's blind. And, you know, he would come to a DrupalCon, you know, he's got his, you know, seeing eye dog or his cane or whatever he had with him at the time. And, you know, if he said, I can't use this, it really brings it home like, oh, I don't want to build software that Everett can't use, you know? And so and the fact that, everybody, well, he was a great developer, right? Yes, I'm sure he still is, but he's not really involved in Drupal right now. But we have this now accessibility community, and Drupal is one of the most accessible content management systems that exist. Part of the reason for that is because people, he was there and he said, I can't use this and shouldn't, and everybody wanted to make him feel included, right? So I think those things are good, including other people. And if somebody says, this language is offending me, right, then we ought to fix it, So.
And so, I mean, you brought up so many good points right now about how people can get involved in the Drupal community without being a code monkey at all. You said Everett did so happen to be a programmer, but it's okay whether he is a programmer or not. So Everett was able to contribute to the community simply by being somebody who was blind and showing up and telling people, I'm not able to use this because you aren't making it accessible to me. And he was able to give that type of contribution to wake people up where they said, oh, wow, we never thought about that. Yeah. This is a good point. You brought up the point about how we've got our code of conduct
more concrete, because just having this abstract idea, well, websites should be accessible. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act or their, international web accessibility standards. That's fine. But having a particular person say, in particular, I can't use this, that's a whole other thing. Yeah,
right.
So, anyway.
And even to look at things when we talk about like gender identity and sexual preferences, the fact that, people who are making other choices can have an impact in the community just by showing up and speaking up to say things. I can give an example so we don't have to get off on the whole kind of, gender type of hot button topic. I think it was, I don't remember if it was Lewis Ninen or not, but there was somebody who actually wanted to start an initiative about at our camps and conferences, the food options that we have there and saying, why do we have so much junk food here? Why do we always have the chips and the cookies in the Coders Lounge? But why don't we have things like fruits and vegetables in the Coders Lounge? Why don't we try to keep our bodies healthy as well? Do you recall that?
I don't remember that particular one, but it sounds like something that several people in the community could definitely come up with. I would support that idea. I like to try to eat healthy food too. So.
Yeah, it's that type of a thing that contributing whatever your individual passion is to the community and helping people to become, more aware of it, more sensitive to it, to be able to make improvements. So I do want to go back to talking about the documentation just so people can get an idea of, and I know you said you were a code monkey before you started in the documentation, and that's fine. I'm a code monkey too.
Still a code monkey, yep.
yeah, it's, like that's my thing. That's what I like to do. And still, the documentation is something that is it's an important part. It's an influential part. It has a big impact. Whether by virtue of the fact of being good or by virtue of the fact of being absent and bad, both of those things could have an influence on people's experience with any product. And in particular with something like Drupal, that is a pretty sophisticated and complicated
There's a learning curve
tool.
for sure.
Yeah. Just getting the idea of like, where do I start? How do I go about doing things? So, and you mentioned you mentioned Addison. She's talking about Addison Berry, who I guess actually I think Addison is now heading up Drupalize.me. I think I just read about.
I don't know if she's in charge, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I just
read at Lullabot.
Right. Yeah, she's at Jeff Robbins had just put a post recently on LinkedIn. I'm trying to get him onto a Drupal TED to talk about his experience, how he was stepping down from his lead role in Lullabot. He was going to do some other things, and he mentioned about a lot of transitions that they had. And one of them was the fact that Drupalize.me has, I guess, officially been broken off Lullabot. And I thought that he said that Addison Berry was actually becoming.
That could be. I haven't been paying too much attention.
CEO or something like that of Drupalize.me. But anyway, Addison Berry is somebody who has taken her own journey being a member of the Drupal community, has actually shared a lot of her personal experience as well. And maybe that'd be great if I could get Addison on the Drupal chat someday as well. Help me out with that, Jennifer. See if I can get get Jeff Robbins and Addison Berry on the chat. So, so anyway, back to the documentation.
So let me talk a little bit about the documentation of Drupal in general. And there is quite a lot of documentation out there, and it comes in several different formats. And I've been involved in most of them, but one of the things that we have within the Drupal software itself is there are little help pages that for each module, and they're not very useful because no one can find anything. Like if you want to do a particular task, it's not clear what module does it. So that's a problem. I'm trying to work on a better help system, and it might get into 8.2 or 8.3 point something, but we'll see about that. I'm working on that one. Another thing that we have is there's also a new module for Drupal 8 called the Tour module, and that allows developers to build what are called tours of various user interface pages. And so that if you're on the view editing page, for instance, that's somewhat complicated, most people think, you have this tour that'll take you through and highlight different areas on the page and tell you what they're for and how to use them, which is very context-specific help. And then outside of the Drupal software itself, we have Drupal.org, which has the community documentation pages. And those are great in some ways because anybody can document anything there. And they're horrible in some places because anybody can document anything there. And so it ends up being sort of a disorganized pile of spaghetti. And back as far as Addison and probably her predecessor as Drupal documentation leader, more than 9 years ago, there's been a thought in the Drupal documentation people that we should have another piece of documentation, which would be a concise, defined user guide for Drupal. And this year, it's actually becoming a reality. So Joe Schindler and I started this project to build a user guide. And we are, we have, as of let's say this week or last week, we have a first draft aside from one page out of the 200 that hasn't been written yet. But anyway, we mostly have a complete first draft, and we're working on editing right now and testing. So testing meaning getting some Drupal novices to actually read through it carefully and see what makes sense and what needs to be fixed. And then, editing ranging from copy editing to content, fixing that content and things like that. And that's what we're working on right now. And I don't know exactly when we'll have it done, but the idea is that once it gets done, it can also be translated into the 160 different languages, speaking of inclusiveness, that Drupal supports, if the international communities of those languages want to do those translations. So that's been a really interesting project. And Joe and I started that last June, end of June, I think it was, at the Twin Cities Drupal camp in Minneapolis. They invited us to come and kick it off there, which we did. It was great. We had 3 or 4 days together to kind of decide what we were doing and make an outline for the guide. And then we had volunteers in the community write the topics. And it's been a very a good experience overall. Having volunteers write the topics meant they didn't always get them done as quickly as we hoped. We had hoped to have something done sooner than this, but 9 months isn't horrible. Or 10 or 12 or whatever it's going to be. But that's coming along. And we do have definitely, now we're in this copy editing phase. And I recently posted something on groups.drupal.org/documentation in the documentation group on Drupal.org, on groups.drupal.org about the copy editing that needs to be done. And so I would encourage anybody that wants to start somewhere and get involved with documentation, help out with that. So we have some pretty easy things to do. Like there's certain terms like we want to use the word such and such and not the word such and such. And you just look in the document for that word and replace it. So, and then there's some more complicated editing jobs for people that want to do more complicated editing as well. So anyway, so that's been really interesting. And I think having a user guide, the part of the purpose of the user guide is to collect the basic information that a site builder in Drupal needs. And part of the purpose of the user guide is to define what the basic skills are that a site builder needs. So you could either use the user guide as your curriculum to learn Drupal, or based on that, at least know what you need to go and learn. So anyway, that's that's the latest documentation thing that I'm pretty excited about. And we should be, hopefully, as we get closer to having it better copy edited and better content than it is right now, we'll start. Hopefully, we're going to get it to a more permanent home on Drupal.org or another site pretty soon.
Good. And so one of the things that you actually mentioned, and the way that people can get involved, is that you're having novices actually read through it and tell you what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And
so we don't really need more testers right at the moment, but if somebody did want to provide some feedback, that would be fine also. But
yeah,
yeah,
it's just an example.
That's another thing. If especially when we have new versions of Drupal, testing out the new features with somebody who didn't write them is always a great thing. And posting, if you find something that's less than optimal in Drupal, I wouldn't say even that it doesn't work, but maybe it's confusing or the user interface is weird. If you post an issue on Drupal.org, that's really, really valuable to the community. That's another thing that people don't think about, but it's a great contribution, is just posting issues that you find, posting something and saying, look, I didn't understand this. I eventually figured it out, but the user interface stood in my way of figuring that out. Those kind of things can be very useful. There's been a lot of usability testing also at that same Drupal conference in Twin Cities that I went to with Joe, and when we launched the user guide project, there was a big usability test that was going on right at the same time. And we got to see the results of it at the end on the last session of the day, the second day of the conference. They'd started it beforehand. And it's always the fact that we have usability tests going on with the Drupal community is a great thing too. It's like, well, we think it should work this way, but we're software developers and we're blind to these usability problems because we know how to use it because we wrote it, So having people come in and test the usability, give them a task and see if they can do it is really a great thing. So I'm rambling.
It's okay. No, this is all great stuff. None of those things that you're mentioning require a person to be a code monkey, and they're all things that can have a big impact in the project itself. So definitely worthwhile hearing about those types of things. And like you said, you were involved in right away in Drupal. You'd gone to Washington D.C. You got involved in a documentation sprint. People don't have to think that the idea of a sprint means that you're going to be coding. They have had other types of sprints or core conversations even that address things like with the usability concerns. And so, just so many ways, and particularly for people who don't know Drupal, who are new to Drupal, so that they aren't blinded by the knowledge that they've acquired. Some of us really aren't going to provide as useful feedback anymore because we've drunk the Drupal Kool-Aid for so long, and we just think, eat, sleep, and drink Drupal. And so to us, all of it makes sense. It's like, well, what's the problem? Like, of course, this is doing exactly what I would expect it to do. Whereas somebody else who doesn't have that kind of familiarity, it's not going to be intuitive at all. And that gives us the opportunity to make these needed improvements that we wouldn't have made in any other fashion. So I do want to continue talking. So you started with the documentation, and actually I do thank you as well for raising the awareness of, well, documentation means more than just one thing. It's not just the handbooks and the guides, et cetera, that you can find on Drupal.org. Documentation is also these other things, the help modules that come with the modules. And by the way, folks, that's another thing that you can do. So Jennifer mentioned filing an issue. One thing that you might file an issue against, let's say you installed some contributed module, you wanted to use the module, you went to their help text, and it didn't make any sense to you, or there was no help text at all. And you could actually file an issue against that contributed module and raise the point. Like, I really want to be able to use this. I'm trying to do these things and I can't figure out how to do it. And here's where I've searched. Your help text doesn't address these points. It would be really helpful if when I click on help and get the help for your module, that it tells me about some of the stuff here.
Or just add a README file. Another thing that you can do is actually a lot of modules have a README.txt file. Sometimes it's like one line, like, install this module and it will slice your bread for you. You could write a new readme.txt file and attach it to an issue in that module and say, hey, I figured out how to use your module and I wrote down these instructions. I don't know if they're useful to you, but they might be useful to another person who downloads your module, do you want to include them? And most of module developers would be like, great, now we have some documentation. So that kind of thing of like, writing down what you figured out or whatever, that can be very, very useful to people.
For sure.
Even if the module developer doesn't accept your contribution, the fact that you attached it to an issue on Drupal.org means someone else might be able to search and find it. So, you might help out somebody just by putting it on an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't have to be something that's officially been committed. But speaking about a module maintainer and committing things, I do want to ask you now about, we can just really quickly go through the progression. And I don't know how soon you were actually granted core committer access to the project.
I can tell you a little bit about how that happened. So, being a programmer, and I've been developing software since, let's say, the mid-'80s. So, I've been a software developer for quite a while. And, also being a documentation writer, one natural place for someone who's both likes documentation and software is the API documentation, the documentation of the functions and classes and things like that are part of Drupal for programmers. This is documentation written usually by programmers for programmers. It's not meant to be for the end user, and it's just documentation that a coder who's working on Drupal would need to know. And so one of the things when I started with Drupal 5 was stable, and Drupal 6 had just come out. And when I started thinking about working on the API documentation, Drupal 6 was stable and 7 was in development and, kind of starting to diverge from Drupal 6. And so I started writing my own module for Drupal and realized I needed this programmer documentation, and it was just garbage, a lot of it. Some of it was good and some of it was garbage. And so, being a programmer and I figured out how the API documentation was generated and stuff and realized, that documentation is in the core source code. I can make an issue and a patch. So I started making issues and patches, and Dries back then was still doing a lot of the committing. There was only him and Gabor, who was the...
Gabor?
Yeah, and then anyway, there were a couple different people who had commit privileges, but not very many. And so mostly Dries was reviewing and committing my patches. And, pretty soon, so I was making patches for Drupal 6 documentation. Pretty soon Drupal 7 opened up and started, and my issues started getting switched over to being Drupal 7 issues. I was like, okay, I'll make patches against Drupal 7. And then by the time Drupal 7 came out, I was actually the number 7 patch contributor for Drupal 7. I contributed the 7th most patches of anybody to the Drupal 7 branch because of all these documentation patches. And I wrote a few code patches here and there, but mostly a lot of them were documentation, and some of them were like, fix some typos or really trivial, but a lot of them were actually substantial updates to the documentation or writing some documentation where none existed. And so, then at some point, Dries approached me and he said, well, would you like to just be able to commit to the, I trust you now. I know you know how to maintain the documentation. Would you like to become a core maintainer with the understanding that you can only commit patches that are documentation? And so I accepted that and became the maintainer for documentation for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. And so that's been going on for a few years. Right now, I rarely do any commits. We have, since I started being the documentation committer over the last couple of years, or last year, I would say, now we have like 8 different committers who have commit privileges to Drupal 8. And they don't really need me to make the commits anymore. When I was doing the commits, it was helpful because I started reviewing patches for other people, and I could review and commit them. And there was there was a real backlog because there was only like Nat, Catch and Alex Pott, and they were it. Now we've got all these other people, and there's not really a backlog, so I don't do commits hardly at all anymore. But I still review almost all of the documentation patches, and that's sort of the role that I'm taking right now as far as the API documentation. So that was maybe more long-winded than you want, but that's sort of the progression of things. I still have my commit privileges. Occasionally, I'm asked to do some emergency repair. Somebody made a commit that broke everything, and I can revert that or whatever. But for the most part, I just I'm back to doing mostly reviews, and I don't write too many documentation patches anymore.
Okay, fair enough. But you actually brought up something else that we didn't mention in terms of documentation. You're talking about the API documentation, so we probably should mention explicitly api.drupal.org. So
yeah,
if you do,
I also maintain the module that runs that site. So that's another one of my many roles in the Drupal community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Neil Drum and I maintain it together. Sometimes it's more him, sometimes it's more me, and yeah.
Yeah, well, good. It is something that's useful. If you are somebody who is a code monkey, and maybe even if you're, it's probably geared more towards code monkeys.
I don't know that API. It's all for coders.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in theory, like the problem with api.drupal.org is you kind of have to know what you're looking for specifically.
It's a reference site for coders. That's right. Yeah. There's actually quite a bit of in Drupal 8 now. There are some pretty good topics on the APIs now. So like if you want to find out about the new plugin system, if you go to api.drupal.org, the landing page for Drupal 8 now lists about 10 different things that you really need to learn about Drupal 8 if you want to code for Drupal 8. And if you read all of those topics, there are also links to longer pieces of documentation about them. But there is actually a pretty good set of tutorial type documentation now on api.drupal.org for coders, which did not exist in Drupal 7. So I'm pretty proud of that. That was mostly my doing also. So yeah,
excellent.
So,
excellent.
And I tried to get other people to write those tutorials. And what ended up happening is I wrote the first draft and then I begged people to review them, which is a lot easier than writing it from scratch. And then they told me all the places I went wrong. I fixed it and we got it in. So that's how those things came to be. There's a lot of people that knew the APIs but didn't have the time or inclination to write the documentation. So I wrote it based on what I saw, and they told me where I was wrong, and I fixed it up, and then we went with that. So that's how all those tutorials got written.
Yeah, and okay, yeah. So you're saying those are more like tutorials as opposed to the traditional API, because the traditional API documentation,
how to use a particular function,
yeah, it actually comes from within the code. We've got these doc blocks that you put. Using this Doxygen syntax, I guess. I don't know whether syntax is the right word for it, but using Doxygen in these doc blocks. And then, as Jennifer mentioned, there's this module that we have that generates the api.drupal.org site to give you an idea of how.
Well, and those tutorials that are on there are also from doc blocks, but they're just in special files. Right.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So, yeah, interesting to hear about that. Interesting to hear how, as well, that pretty much you stuck with the commitment, no pun intended, of your commits only being, for document related. But just the same, I think to kind of start winding things down here, the fact when you are rising to the level of having core commit is just about the top that a person could reach in the Drupal committee. Like it doesn't get much higher than that.
Okay, so let's take that back and say, as a coder, that's true. But if you're contributing to Drupal in a different way, you're unlikely ever to be given core commit privileges to Drupal.org, but you could still become a leader in the in other aspects. Like you could become one of the leadership people in the documentation group and not have core commit privileges. You could become a great themer and not have core commit privileges.
Right.
You could be somebody that tirelessly works on the community committee that we talked about before that mediates these community disputes and do a great service to the community and not be a core committer. And I think, it's a problem if we think that the pinnacle of the Drupal community is the core committers. I think it's one of many. It is sort of the people that are trusted the most, or that have made a certain commitment to Drupal core code. But there are also people that maintain contributed modules that are just as important in some ways as the core code. So. What would we do without Path Auto and views before it was in core? So I think when we talk about core committers being the pinnacle, we're doing a disservice to all the people that contribute to Drupal in other ways. So.
Okay, fair enough. Stand guilty as charged.
Okay.
I stand corrected.
And this is something that we're always struggling with as a community too, is how to recognize all of those contributions, because people always recognize the contributions to the code. We publish lists of who made the most patches or whatever, and we don't always recognize the people who really fixed up a lot of documentation, or who have been, have made a base theme that everybody wants to use because it's so perfect, things like that. Or that spurred the adoption of HTML5, or that made sure, that leads the accessibility or usability team and has really contributed to Drupal 8 being much better software, even though they'd never made a commit in their life, So I think we need to just be careful to recognize all the contributions that we can.
Yeah, and there are, as we've been saying, there are so many ways to be able to contribute. So, mea culpa. I don't mean to reinforce that kind of a notion that the only thing that actually counts and gets you any credit is if you can show how many commits that you've made. So, let's ignore the way that I had done the setup with the question and try to get to having started out making your contributions. And I mean, like, Dries is the one who actually recognized you and approached you. To have Dries be the person who says, "Hey, I've noticed you've been doing some stuff. Would you like to be involved in?" Is that vaults you right to a leadership.
And he's
position,
the only person who can authorize a new person to become a core committer. So I think that's just how things are. He's the owner of the project in some ways.
Right.
Yeah.
But there are other leadership positions, as you're mentioning. It's not just about whether you become a core committer. It's not just about whether Dries personally recognizes you, but there are so many other ways that you can get involved. And another person I hope to have on the show that we're working to set it up is Kathy Thies, because she really gets involved with the whole mentoring type of program.
Yeah, and that program was just started by a few people who said, we have all these new people and they don't know how to get involved in coding. How can we help them? And they just set up this mentoring program from nothing, and it was great, And Jess was another person who was involved in the mentoring program originally, and now she's a core committer.
Right, so, XJM.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
so there are many routes to getting involved, and they're really all worthwhile. So.
Yeah, and so let's just wrap it up then to give the people a sense of, and so what? So what do you get out of it when you get involved? And again, it's not about whether you get to become a core committer. The point that I'm driving towards here is that you've gotten involved, you've reached a level of a leadership position, which means that you are now in communication and associating with a particular group of people. And so let's just
that's really what I get out. So
exactly.
Let me tell you what I get out of contributing to Drupal.
Right.
Me personally, and I don't know, I can't speak for anybody else, but I can speak for myself. So the first thing is the sense of community, of belonging and being a part and helping out a community of people that I see occasionally in person. I call them my imaginary friends in between, because I just talk to them on the text chat on IRC. And so I have all these imaginary friends all over the world that aren't really imaginary, but, and that's valuable to me. Just, if I want to talk to somebody in Germany, I know I can get on IRC and talk to somebody in Germany anytime, and I know them, and I've met them, and they're really great people. So that's one thing. Of course, in my spiritual belief system, I think that helping other people is the most important thing in the world. And so I think Drupal is a good piece of software. And so anything that I can do to make it better documented, better code is fulfilling to me in a sort of a spiritual fulfillment sort of way. And maybe not everybody feels that way, and also the things that I do as far as reviewing patches and mentoring the new contributors, which I don't really mentor per se, but you try to be encouraging and positive, even when you're saying that a patch needs some work. Those kinds of things I think are also valuable to help other people be able to fulfill their desires to contribute to the community. So I think that's, and then I'm also involved in my local community here I live in Spokane, Washington in the US, and I'm involved in my local community. I started a meetup that we have once a month. It's not a huge community here. We have about 8 people that come regularly to our meetings. But for those 8 people, those 2 hours that we meet every month are very valuable. And, I feel good that I'm helping them get more in-depth knowledge about Drupal as well. And so it's the giving back thing, and to me, giving back is part of my spiritual fulfillment. To others, maybe it just feels good and they don't call it spiritual fulfillment or whatever. But so it's being involved, that I like the people that are part of the community, and it makes me feel good to be involved and to give back. So I think those are the real bottom lines for me. And then, of course, then there's also, I'll just be honest, sometimes there's a sense of pride, and I can look at a piece of documentation or the api.drupal.org site. A lot of people contributed things for the api.drupal.org site, but I feel a large sense of ownership for that site, and I'm very proud of it. And so, and I know a lot of people use it, and so that there's a sense of pride in that too. And even if all you did was comment on an issue that moved it, made a comment on an issue that moved it forward, or filed an issue that pointed out a problem, once that gets fixed, you can point to that piece of the Drupal software and say, hey, I'm the reason, or I'm part of the reason that this got fixed. So there's some pride of ownership in that too. So I think those are what makes it work for me.
Totally understood. And as well, I'm right on board with you there with that sense of, that spiritual fulfillment, being part of the community, and for people who may not be as spiritually inclined, to just kind of wrap it up here, is that when you have major connections in the Drupal community will tend to have your back as well, which means that when opportunities come along and people need to be coming up with recommendations and giving, options for people, they're going to be passing along the names of the people who they know. And so
do you need a job? Okay, you can get one. There's some financial security in this too. If I got into financial straits and did need a job, I've been freelancing for 15 years at this point, but heaven forbid if that didn't work out anymore and I needed a job, I would get on IRC and I think I would have a job offer within an hour. I mean, that's probably within a minute, but anyway, there is some certainly possible financial reward in my future for that if I needed it.
Yeah, just opportunities that can. Well, I hope you don't either. But whether it's a full-time job or even freelancing, or when you look at things like when Acquia is giving $500,000 in grants to get modules ported to Drupal 8, or when the Drupal Association is saying we need people to work on the Drupal.org website to do some updates, the type of people who are going to come into those opportunities are the ones who are known and who come to mind. And the people who are having to make those decisions are the people who are in the leadership positions. And, so these types of big opportunities are brought to people who have been involved in the community. So, definitely from even, a financial perspective, there's a lot of benefits to be had. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat with me,
it's been fun.
to give me an opportunity to do, part of my piece to contribute to the community by producing, this little chat, and, hopefully being able to do my part to bring more people into the fold. So it was great talking with you. Thanks again for the time that you were willing to spend. And we'll have to say hello to each other in, what is today, the April 11th? So, and what is it, the 9th or the 19th? When's New Orleans?
I think it starts on the 9th, but I will not be there.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I won't see you there then.
No.
But we'll have to meet, in real life at some
days.
Other conference or camp at some point.
Yes.
And, wonderful chatting with you.
Appreciate having a soapbox to stand on for a while. And I'm always willing to share my opinions on things. So, yeah, it's been fun.
Great. Happy to have you share your opinion. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks again for being on the show.
You too. Bye.
Bye.